collaboration with Jofi and the List Institute, where we come out with typically with Danube Institute fellows and researchers, and do a event. But today I am my own researcher, so I'm going to be representing myself. Jofi asked me what to talk on, and there's a degree of overlap with what I talked about in December. But the title I came up with was Hungary in the Uncanny Valley, Misrecognition, Proximity, and the Limits of Western Empathy. And the context of this talk, and I'll explain what I mean by Uncanny Valley, is that, look, I'm British, and I've been living in Hungary for 5 years last week. So 5 busy, very exciting years. And I have some observations about Hungary from a comparative perspective, from the perspective of someone from the Anglosphere. Because I think sometimes Hungary is a country that is a bit misunderstood. And I think this is regardless of actually which government is in power. Obviously there's an election recently. And I just wanted to see if I could distill some ideas around that and in a structured way. And I've got some notes here, but I'm going to be fairly free with myself just to riff around it a little bit for maybe 25 minutes, half an hour, and then we'll have a chat, and he'll tell me if he agrees, and especially probably if he disagrees as well, so it should be a good discussion. So I've titled this Hungary in the Uncanny Valley. Okay, so first of all, what is the Uncanny Valley? So some of you may know, but in animation or robotics, there's this concept of the uncanny valley. And what it is, imagine a graph where there's like a graph like this and there's a line going up, right? And it's that if you have like a stick figure in animation and you kill the stick figure, you don't feel much. If it's in a more advanced animation, like a Pixar character, right? Especially if it's one of the old movies, which is pretty good, you have higher empathy, right? You can feel something. If, of course, it's a real actor, and usually a good actor, it's you have kind of full empathy with that, right? But there's something very interesting that happens in animation. If you've ever seen the movie, for instance, The Polar Express, some of you may be too young to have seen this movie, but it's a 2002 Tom Hanks movie. And in it, the characters were animated in a way that was hyper-realistic. So they almost looked real, but their eyes were a little bit dead. And the movie bombed. And because people found the animation not familiar, but it repelled them. And what's interesting is our empathy goes up, and as soon as the more human it gets, the more empathy we have. And just before it becomes fully human, our empathy tanks like this, and then it goes back again. And that's the uncanny valley. So a robot with like fake skin, you know, we feel a sense of revulsion towards them when it's like plastic skin and a bit dead in the eyes. And I have this idea that, taking this as an analogy, that sometimes I feel Hungary falls in, from an Anglo perspective, into sort of an uncanny valley of political empathy. Because if you're Anglo, and I say Anglo just because I am, so that's my frame of reference, and you read about something in China, it's so different, the frame of reference is so different, we have such a little understanding of the frame of reference that we don't feel that much about it. As an example, I remember reading 10, 15 years ago in a newspaper a case about a mining accident in China. And, well, actually it was a mining accident in America, and there was 12 miners trapped down a mine. And I really felt it, because I can imagine their lives. I know what trucks they drive, I know what their homes would look like, because it's kind of my culture. But then in the same, and it was a front page story for like 2 weeks. And then in the same newspaper there was like a side column one day saying 150 Chinese miners trapped down a mine. And I thought, well, that's terrible. But I didn't feel it in quite the same way, just because it's such a different frame of reference that I couldn't really imagine their lives. And I'd lived in China for 2 years, I still struggled. And I don't think that's so unusual. And so it's the more distant something culturally is, it's almost like there's this slightly lower understanding. And then if I think about, say, Iran, it's kind of like Pixar, I can kind of imagine that. Or even Bulgaria is kind of in that sort of context. And then if it's French, you know, they're just like us, which is why we hate the French, you know, if we're British. And so they give full empathy and also full, you know, you have to fall out with your siblings occasionally, you know. But then what are the Hungarians? The Hungarians are kind of betwixt and between. Kandira wrote that Hungary is culturally Western but politically Eastern. And there's something slightly uncanny about it. Because Hungarians kind of, you know, I'd say sound like, they don't actually sound Western European, but they in many frames of reference, it feels very familiar. But you look at it, there's something just slightly different. And so I feel sometimes Hungary falls into this sort of uncanny valley from the Anglo perspective of political empathy, where we're not quite sure what we're looking at. And in the vacuum that creates, sometimes I think there's a sense of suspicion. And there's another thing that Hungarians suffer a little bit in the European context. We've all got a stereotype in our mind of an Italian. We've got a stereotype of a German. We've got a stereotype of, of a Frenchman. We don't really have a stereotype of a Hungarian. I asked a friend, I've been surveying some friends, and I said, what's a stereotype of a Hungarian? And they said, gulyás. And I said, well, that's a food. What about the people? What is the body language? And no one could come up with anything. But the thing is with stereotypes, of course, they're kind of prejudiced a little bit, but they also protect people. You know, Berlusconi in Italy was a pretty corrupt guy, but he kind of got away with it because people just said he's just kind of Italian. And the thing is, but if you find other nations where you're not protected by that stereotype and there's an equivalent thing, then people have some sort of suspicion. So anyway, so I think that just as a starting point, that was just a starting point of why I termed it this way, because I think Hungary is a small enough nation that is kind of missing in terms of the worldview we have. It's a nation that's there, but from an Anglo perspective, for a lot of historical reasons, it's kind of lacked a narrative identity, sometimes in the West. And I think that's changed a bit in the last 10 years. Whatever one's view of the previous Hungarian government that's just left, one thing they definitely achieved, whether you like it or not, is they kind of put Hungary on the map politically. They have quite a clear identity. And so I want to just talk about some reflections on some interesting similarities, again from the Anglosphere to Hungary, but also some differences. So okay, similarities first. Well, okay, speaking as a Brit, sometimes my British friends and relations occasionally say, so what's Hungary like? And I say, well, it's kind of like the UK, in some ways. I mean, the UK, you've got England, you've Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Am I missing anything? No, I think that's probably most of it. And you never know with the UK where it ends, it keeps going. Used to be worldwide at one point. And actually Hungary's a bit like that, because you've got Hungary, Magyarország, and then you've got the bits around Hungary that the Hungarians very quietly say, well, it's still Hungary. Because of course, until 1920, Slovakia, Transylvania and Romania, northern Serbia, north of Belgrade, a little bit of Ukraine and so on, obviously was Hungary. And the Hungarians very quietly just say, it's still Hungary. But the one is definitely true. When you cross the border, there's still a lot of Hungarians in those areas. And so that's kind of like the UK. You've got England, you've got Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. In Hungary, you have the biggest cathedral in the little town on the border with Slovakia, in Esztergom. Beautiful cathedral, worth going to. And in Britain, our most glorious cathedral is in Durham, a small town on the border with Scotland. They both have, you have Balaton, the massive lake in the northwest of Hungary. By the way, you can see Balaton from a plane window, and it's also, you can see it on a world map. So you can actually measure Europe in Balatons, and I counted, it's 42 Balatons wide, Europe. So it's a useful unit of measurement for continents. But also and we've got the Lake District in England, which is kind of like our Balaton, but just broken up into smaller lakes. And of course, like many countries, Budapest has a very liberal, big capital city, and quite a conservative country. And the UK has a big liberal capital city in a actually quite conservative country. Some other similarities. Humour is quite similar, Brits and Hungarians. Brits, our humour is kind of like dark, self-deprecating, kind of absurd. Hungarians, pretty dark humour, kind of absurd. I mean, what's funny is, of course, in Britain, we're very proud of Monty Python. And the funny thing with Monty Python is the Germans don't get the jokes, and the French don't like the jokes because the jokes are about them. But the Hungarians get it and they like it, to the extent to which in the 90s, the Hungarians basically just translated Monty Python into Hungarian. There was a comedy troupe on TV called Hollow, which means raven. And apparently the jokes just all worked. And so something similar. And actually, as a side of that sort of humour, I have a good Hungarian friend who said to me, he said, Shakespeare is a great Hungarian writer. Which I think, and I don't know what he meant, but I think it's true. There's also this interesting sort of special relationship. In the UK, we often like talking that we have, or saying that we have a special relationship with America. But the Americans don't really know about this. We talk about it, right? And it's very interesting being in Hungary is that I sometimes feel the Hungarians have a special relationship with Britain, but we don't really know about it. They're very proud of saying our parliament is like the British Parliament, but 1 metre bigger. If you cross the Great Bridge in the centre of Budapest, the Lánchíd, the Széchenyi Bridge, it leads you into Clark Adam Tér. Clark Adam was a great Scot, and I think the bridge was built by another man, or the engineering of the tunnel, the Alagut, I think was also another Clark built that. And sometimes I just think, what I say to British friends, I say, if you want to understand the similarity between, or in a sense, the biggest similarity is actually the biggest difference, which is that I think we're both island nations. I'll explain what I mean, because Britain, we're an island surrounded by water, and in a sense, Hungary is a linguistic island surrounded by land. And I sometimes say to people, they're the only two nations where you can give a chemical equation to explain the differences in their history, which is simply H2O, water. How different would British history be without the Channel? And how different would Hungarian history be if it had a little bit of water around it to protect them from the ravening hordes of whoever was invading them throughout the last 1,000 years? So those are some interesting similarities, and I just want to quickly talk about, perhaps not so quickly, but talk about the differences. And I think there are kind of four main differences that I've picked up on anyway, since I've been in Hungary. And I think they are basically the relationship to the past, the relationship to place and geography, the relationship to each other, and the relationship to the sense of being, in that case, Hungarian. And I think in all four areas you can see interesting differences that from an Anglo perspective are like the world through a different lens, totally different lens. And I think without understanding that, it's very difficult to understand the culture, but also some of the decisions that come out of the culture, indeed politically. And I'm not making it's not a party political thing, just generally. Okay, so first, let's start with history. Well, as I've noted with the Channel, and mentioning the H2O and how water determines different fates for these two interesting, in a sense, island nations. And I should note, I should probably start with language. I mean, of course, one of the differences is the language in Hungary, before I begin anything. I don't know how many people here are Hungarian, but I've tried learning Hungarian in the last 5 years, and I have utterly failed. It is a deviously difficult language. This joke doesn't always go down very well, but sometimes Hungarians have said to me, you hear this a lot, people say, the Pope once said that Hungarian is a language spoken in heaven because it takes an eternity to learn it, which is a good joke, but my reply, which I'm quite proud of, was actually it's the language spoken in hell because it takes an eternity to learn it and you suffer, because it's extremely difficult to learn. And but I'm told a very rewarding language to master because the poetry is very subtle. And I'm coming from a culture that, despite having Shakespeare and so on, I mean, bear in mind, Shakespeare had to make up several thousand words in order to make beautiful language, because our language is actually not as good at gradations of meaning. Whereas in Hungary, everything is gradations of meaning, and we'll come back to that later. But Hungarian is difficult for me in three ways. First, it has agglutinative grammar, so the endings of all the words change. And so you have to really change many words in the sentence to make any sense. And to put it in context, I mean, I speak some Chinese, so hopefully I'm good at languages, but I couldn't, I really struggled in Hungarian. And then I went to Iraq, and I was in rural Iraq, and I spent 4 days in a village with Assyrian Christians. And after 4 days, I was able to say, was it Shakba Mahashka Anazali Erbil Wa Budapest? I could say, tomorrow morning I will go to Erbil and fly to Budapest. And to this day, I still cannot say that in Hungarian. So it's a very challenging language grammatically. Also has no shared roots, so very few loan words from other languages. It looks like Chinese in a sense when you read it. Although actually what it looks like to my eye when I look at it is black speech from the Ring in Lord of the Rings. There's lots of Zs and Uks at the end of things. And and also a bit like Chinese because the names are the other way around. And finally, one of the challenges is pronunciation. Sometimes I feel if you've played a brass instrument, it's helpful to speak Hungarian because you really have to use your lips and your tongue and where it is in your mouth to say things. So there's a great Hungarian word for troublemaker, which is bolykeverő, right? Great word, you shout it at any child who's running around in Hungary. And but the way my mouth would want to say it is bolykeverő, but not bolykeverő. So it's I had to learn to reshape your mouth, and then you have to think like you're playing a brass instrument. So that's that. But But as a consequence of language, Hungary has, I think, a very different frame of reference, and we can't really detach that from any discussion or analysis. But having said all that about language, I just want to talk about history and the Hungarian relationship to history, because as I've noted talking about this sort of linguistic island, and I think I've just outlined how it's a linguistic island. And one last thing on the linguistic island, actually, on this, is that another analogy for it, in my view, is if you've ever seen the tree of life, where it has like, all of the invertebrates and then the vertebrates, right? And so you have like the eye evolved with the mammals and so on over here. And then the eye evolved completely separately with the cephalopods, the octopuses, which are one of the invertebrates over here. If you look at the tree of languages, there's all the Indo-European languages. And then over here, there's just Hungarian, basically. So it's kind of like the cephalopod of languages. It's like an octopus sort of language that's evolved its own thing over here, completely independent. It's quite extraordinary. And right there, slap down, bang in the middle of Europe, a language that came out of apparently beyond the Urals, though no one ever is quite sure. Sometimes people say it has a relationship to Finnish, but I know a Finn who speaks fluent Hungarian, and I said, so can you tell the similarity? She goes, God, no. I cannot tell. She said, it's at a deep linguistic level, you don't really notice it day to day. Okay, so back to history of this sort of island nation idea. Well, there's a fundamental difference, not just in the history of, say, Britain and Hungary, but actually the emotions that come from that because of the history. Because if you think about British history, it's been one damn lucky escape, or indeed victory, after another throughout history. From the Armada, or from Agincourt to the Armada, from Trafalgar to Waterloo, from World War I to World War II, Britain has always been quite fortunate. We were very fortunate when not speaking Spanish because there was a storm in the Channel which sank the Spanish Navy, thankfully, which I don't let my Spanish friends forget. But Hungarian history is kind of almost precisely the opposite, because precisely we didn't have the Channel. The Channel was crucial to all these battles that we won essentially over the years. But if you look at the Hungarian history, 1241, the Tatars invade, they destroy up to 80% of settlements, kill up to 25% of the population. A couple of centuries later, you have the Battle of Mohacs, the 500th anniversary of which is this August, on the 29th of August, which killed off most of the nation's nobility and its leaders, ended independent Hungary, and then basically led eventually to the Ottoman occupation for 150 years. That was then ended by Hungary falling under the rule of the Habsburgs, who they then failed to shake off in the 1848 revolution, which led to them being on the side that then lost World War I, which led to the Treaty of Trianon, stripping the country of 2/3 of its territory and 1/3 of the people, which arguably led to them joining the Germans in World War II, simply because they wanted the territory back. And as punishment, obviously, for doing that and all the horrors that ensued, then the Soviets then occupied Hungary, against which the Hungarians fashioned a revolution in 1956, because they were opposed to many things. There were many reasons for that revolution, but of course that was a famous failed revolution. And then that led to the subsequent Soviet occupation until 1990. So in a sense, they've just had these very, very different histories. And I should note that these sort of 1848 and 1956 are famous sort of failed revolutions, but in Hungary they are seen and felt as real moments of national pride, because sometimes, in the British mindset we think of the great victories and so on, but the Hungarians have this very interesting thing. They really feel most pride in having just survived through these horrors. And there's just this sense of just like a boxer on the ropes taking punches, and we got through it. As a small nation surrounded, a landlocked nation actually, surrounded by the to and fro and the back and forth of hostile currents of history, tides of history swamping the country every now and again. But there's a context, so it's not the context, but the emotionality of what I'm talking about, I think, is very interesting, because we Brits, we think a lot about our history in an analytical sense. Endless bookshops full of books about bits of British history. But the truth is we don't really feel much about it. We're well read about that history, but this history doesn't really live in our souls. We talk about it, but crucially our history does not make us fall into silence. Because why would it? There's little to lament, and not that much that's a source of grievance. For Hungarians, I find their relationship to history to be very different. It's very close to the surface, it's very relevant to the present. The history is alive, not dead, and that sense of injustice, be it something from a long time ago or something more recent, burns very brightly. There's a little anecdote on this. 5 years ago when I moved to Hungary, I was once in a taxi, and the taxi driver was a guy with a top knot, sleeve tattoo, 25 years old, driving too fast through the city. And he spent the entire taxi journey very emotionally talking about the injustice of the 1241 Mongol invasion of Hungary. And at the end of the journey, I kind of assumed that he was some sort of folk culture, nationalist or something, maybe a conservative in some way. And I asked him, and he just said, I think no, absolutely not. He was just some liberal guy from Budapest. But he still really felt this history. It's a national thing. And it's interesting how subsequently I read a scholar writing in the 1980s, he said, the Hungarian national obsession is with history, particularly the tragedies and defeats, and it's an obsession that spans generations and transcends politics. And everything I've seen has confirmed this. And there's actually a poem by Ender Addy which kind of captures this. It was a famous poem. This is translated into English, and I'll just read it quickly. He wrote a poem that goes like this. If there be a God, he need not spare a people used to beatings, a callow, tepid-hearted gypsy people, just thrash and thrash and thrash. If there be a God, he need not pity me. I was born a Hungarian. Send no dove with sprig of green, just beat and lash. If there be a God, may he drag us right from the earth to the gleaming sky. Give us not a minute's peace, for that will be an end of us, an end. So there's this kind of very different relation to history, first of all. From an Anglo experience, it seems kind of alien because we are so detached from our traditions and our history. We are sort of pickled in our own sort of historical success, and therefore a certain, complacency, maybe, which is also buoyed by other things too. I think particularly the fact that we are such a vast culture, and I'll come back to this later, such a vast culture linguistically, we're never really feeling we're under threat as such. Whereas if you're a relatively small language group, fairly isolated, and have suffered these ravages of history, you're more likely to feel that things could be washed away if you didn't spend time and invest in trying to maintain it. So that's history. What about geography? I mentioned before the sort of island idea, but obviously there's a big difference is that Britain actually is an island. But it's not actually just Britain that's an island. If you think about it, the entire Anglosphere is islands. Canada and America are surrounded by water. And I'll come back to the exception. Britain, obviously an island, famously a wet, miserable island. But I love it, but it's still wet. Australia, New Zealand, islands. And there's two exceptions to this, by the way. There's two exceptions. There's the Mexican border, and there's the Irish border. And I should just note the Mexican border is the biggest political flashpoint in America. Donald Trump would not be in politics if it wasn't for the Mexican border. And of course, the Irish border was the biggest flashpoint in Brexit. And indeed, prior to that, the IRA and their connected issues, because one of the fears of hardening that border would be bringing back the IRA. So, but here's the interesting thing. In the Anglosphere, you know when the nation ends, apart from those borders. You know when the nation ends. You can cover your eyes and walk, and when your feet get wet and salty, the nation's over. You've hit the ocean. The thing is with Hungary, so in that sense, we have very objective borders. It just ends. Whereas if you're in a country like Hungary, and it's not unique to Hungary, there are many nations like this, probably most nations actually, but if you're in Hungary, certainly, the Hungarians love to say they're the only nation surrounded by themselves because of the history of historic Hungary being bigger. And so in Hungary, you cover your eyes and you cross the border and you'll still meet people speaking on Hungarian, perhaps with a slight accent, but still Hungarian. And in this sense, Hungary has sort of subjective borders. And the reality of this sort of geographical reality, and not just the fact of it, but the implication of it culturally, was really brought home to me a few years ago. When the Ukraine war broke out on the 24th of February, my birthday actually, in 2022, I didn't appreciate it being on my birthday, didn't need that. When that happened, I had a very good friend who then went to Transcarpathia, so in Ukraine, where there's a Hungarian minority there. In fact, they may in fact be the majority, I think, in that region. And she went, and she came back very emotional, and she said, she said, those were the best Hungarians I've ever met. She's Hungarian from Budapest. She's a conservative Hungarian from Budapest. And she said, they were just the most Hungarian Hungarians I'd ever met. Their grammar was perfect. And she said, none of our grammar is perfect. It's an impossible language. And then she said they wrote poetry Hungarian. Their house was full of, just, it felt very Hungarian. I've never been anywhere that felt just so my own culture. And she said it was extraordinary because it wasn't near Budapest. It was as far from Budapest as you can be and still be around Hungarians, other than perhaps London. And so, so with her I started writing an article about this region in order to raise some money for them or something. And I had this idea that there's a kind of an analogy here. Well, is that, okay, so I wrote this piece, and I'll come back to what the analogy is in a minute, but I wrote this piece talking about nations being like gardens you have to tend, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I wrote this piece, and then when it was finished, I sent it to several Hungarian friends. And they wrote back to me, and one said, why are you calling it Transcarpathia from Hungary? It's Subcarpathia. Someone else said, why are you focusing on this Russian war threatening the Hungarians and Ukrainians as a threat to the Hungarians? Someone else said, why are you focusing on the Hungarians and Ukrainians are suffering too? And someone else said, why are you drawing attention to the Hungarians at all? Leave us out of it. We don't want to draw attention. And around the same time as I was writing this, I went down to Serbia, and I was talking to a woman there from Kosovo. And she said, oh, where are you living? Hungary. Oh, what are the Hungarians like? And I said, well, they have these wonderful idioms, like, Tubic Veset Mohac, war was lost at the Battle of Mohac. It means it could be worse. And she, with no irony, no joke, she looked at the sky and she went, Mohac, one of our great victories. And it's really interesting that you go 200 miles and something that's a historic sort of defeat that has passed into idiom in Hungary is just taught in schools where she was from in Kosovo is just actually a victory because there's more of an Ottoman heritage there. And so these stories really taught me something. Well, at first that Kosovo story, but also particularly this article I wrote, it taught me something quite profound about the region. And I would say I didn't publish that piece in the end about the Transcarpathia. I didn't publish it, but because of all these complications. But you know what? I learned more about the region in my failure to publish that article, my failure to be satisfied with it, than anything I'd read. Because it taught me how much that everything is contested. There's so many different angles. And to the Anglo mind, that's such an alien concept, because we really work in this very digital way that, you know, I think sometimes because of our islandness, it's kind of affected our metaphysics, because it's all here and there, us and them, black and white, right and wrong, true and false. It's very clear. And if you look at a lot of the challenges around or a lot of the ways the Americans talk about geopolitics, they often speak in this Manichaean sense that you're either with us or against us, sort of thing. Whereas if you travel to most places outside the Anglosphere that are not being the beneficiaries of this type of geography, people are aware that everything needs to be negotiated because they're not protected in the same way. Most of the world faces this in some sense. But Hungary is very much a case of this because it is definitely facing this problem. Also, it has their own population beyond the border, which adds an extra diplomatic element. And also, they're a relatively small country in a part of the world that has started both world wars. And they've suffered the ravages of that. So it's a very interesting case, and it's kind of humbling, actually, as an Anglo to go there and to experience that and live in that culture and recognize how differently the world looks through eyes like that. It occurred to me that, you know, in British culture, our great origin story of modern Britain, our genesis story, is World War II, of course. We think of ourselves as the plucky underdog who sat there on an island, then went in and beat the Nazis, right? We all conveniently forget that the Russians did most of the work, and the Americans obviously gave us a bunch of guns and ham and stuff. So, but that's a kind of origin story. But what's interesting about World War II for the Anglosphere is, in a sense, World War II was a workplace activity. We went to the war. There were a few bombs dropped on our cities, of course, or quite a few bombs. But you know what we didn't have? We didn't have soldiers in our houses. We didn't have soldiers in our bedrooms. It's a very different psychology, I think, between having been bombed, which is inconvenient and dangerous, and having a sense of cultural violation of armies crossing your territory. And I simply don't think the Anglosphere understands the emotionality of that and how much it traumatizes a culture. And one of the reasons it matters is that, of course, winners write history, and the Anglosphere culturally have been real winners for a long time. Partly the British Empire, partly America's might in the 20th century, But what we've had is this cultural dominance, which means that here we are in Brussels talking about Hungary with people who, very few of them may be British, and we're speaking in which language? And Britain isn't even part of the EU anymore, we're speaking in English. You know, this is the global lingua franca. And that's just an accident of history, but I think it's led to this sort of naivety about things, because we don't really understand what it's like to lose something yet, but we may yet learn. I'm probably going over time a bit, but I want to just mention a couple of other things and I'll wrap up. I'll sort of reverse what I was going to do here. Moving on from that, I just talked about the Subcarpathia idea, and I mentioned in this article I wrote, I didn't tell you what the article was actually saying, and I'll do that now, because, you know, as I've noted, we Brits are a little bit indifferent about our culture and our history. We're a big fleshy culture. We're not really worried that English is going to die out, you know, and so that sort of understanding is not really implied in our culture. Oh, and by the way, sorry, what I just said before about English being dominant culture is that as a consequence of that, all the world's institutions and structures are basically done in English. And so, in a sense, it's our frame of reference framing the world. And so the emotions that we had, or the lack of emotion we had in it, is invested into the architecture of the world we know in the world order. And the more emotional and more sort of deeply rooted and felt understanding of oneself that you see in countries like Hungary almost doesn't have a language to be spoken of in the institutional system. And I think that's one of the real dangers right now. And I think part of this is why countries like Hungary are sometimes misunderstood. For instance, if you look at the issue of migration, which is not a political point, you know, all parties in Hungary in parliament seem to be quite restrictive on migration, including the new government. That attitude towards migration of saying, look, we just want to be left alone, we're a relatively small culture, we don't have a high birth rate, we don't really want people from the outside being here, particularly just want to be left alone. That was an impossible thing to say in Britain 10 years ago. Maybe even now it's difficult to say. But because we're a big culture, we're only now beginning to see the dangers of that. Whereas if you are from a smaller nation that has been crisscrossed by history, then of course it's going to be more present. But I think some of the pushback Hungary has received and will continue to receive on its views on migration are part of, it reflects less about Hungary and more about the architecture of the world's norms, which is set by a culture that has not had to experience that existential angst that comes with feeling under threat. So look, we're in the Anglosphere, a big fleshy culture, not too worried about our fate, though we're beginning to think about it. But Hungarians are very different. They're very conscious, as I've noted, that things can be lost. And because history and their own scale, being a relatively small culture, is taught them this. And here I just want to tell you about what I wrote this article about. I had this analogy in my head. I like gardening, don't get much time for it, and the weather's never that good for it, but in principle I love gardening. In practice I'll outsource it, but it's a great concept. And I think, in a sense, national cultures are a bit like gardens. Because think about what you are as a culture, you know. What does a culture need? It needs the sedimented soil of its own history in which to plant the new growth. Every generation blooms a sort of flower of its own, you know, to take an analogy, of its own current generation, its music and so on, right? But of course that is growing out of the nutrients of the previous generation's bloom flower, which bloomed, wilted, decayed, and rendered the soil fertile. So all of us are living in sort of sedimented soil of our own history from which the new growth comes. But the problem is with Hungary is that, and nations like Hungary, is that it's seen its sedimented soil of its history either carted away by someone or salted and ruined, like invaders used to salt fields. So the soil is not always that rich. If you go in Hungary, it's quite hard to find really old buildings, actually, because the Habsburgs crushed all the castles a few hundred years ago, just to punish them for a revolution against Rákóczi, I think it was. Among other things. And obviously the world wars have destroyed everything. In Budapest right now, if you go to the castle district, it looks old. A lot of it's been rebuilt the last few years under the Haussmann project in the old style because everything was bombed to pieces in World War II. So things like that. And so you need a sedimented soil of the history, and you also kind of need light for things to grow, of course. You cannot have too many trees overlooking your garden because the small plants won't grow. And if you think about Hungary, it is actually quite a small nation, overshadowed by the canopies of much bigger cultures, Slavic cultures, Germanic cultures, and so on. And so they don't have much light to work with. So there's not very good soil, not very good light. And the consequence for me, I think Hungarians have become sort of constant gardeners, very skilled gardeners of national identity, which explains, I think, what I said before, this idea that the Hungarian national obsession is history. Because there is a sense that if we don't talk about it, then it will go away. If we don't talk about ourselves, then we won't exist. And there's this constant dialogue. It's amazing how often you can talk to Hungarians and the conversation will weave in culture, history, and art and so on. It's a fierce sort of pride and narrative engagement with the past and the breadth of the culture, in a way that is not always present. I mean, in the Anglosphere, we're constantly thinking we need to change things, we need to revise things and evolve things. And Hungarians are often saying, we just want to preserve stuff, thanks, because the world's changing anyway, and we aren't really in control of that fate, so we're just going to hang on to this, thank you. That's kind of the attitude often. So I just think that, when you think of national identity, I think the Hungarians have a very strong engagement with it, just because they have to. And in Britain, we can just think, look, I do nothing, it will still be there. We're starting to realize that may not be the case. But I think the Hungarians knew this a long time ago. In fact, never thought otherwise. My last point I just want to touch on is, so I've talked about the differences between the Hungarian relationship to the past and history, and how it's different from the Anglosphere, and how it makes it difficult sometimes for Anglos to understand the context. Second, I talked about geography. And third, about the relationship to the culture itself. But the final thing I want to talk about is sort of the relationship people have, in a sense, with themselves or with each other. So, there's a couple of things here. There's a guy called Edward Hall, who he's a sociologist, and he had a concept of high and low context cultures. So, a high context culture is one where the meaning of a sentence is dependent on context, a lot of the time, where communication is not necessarily direct, it's kind of indirect. It's implied, you have to work it out. Where subtext matters, not the words, it's kind of the underlying meaning, and where to understand things you need sort of implicit social knowledge to understand the broader context of where you are. And there's low context cultures where the meaning is explicit, communication is direct, the text is the text, it's very literal, and there are more formal rules rather than implicit social knowledge. The Anglosphere is pretty low context. America is a super low context. Americans will just tell you straight to your face what they say and what they mean, and they're very literal. In fact, if you look at a lot of this progressive social justice stuff, this obsession with language, it's a very literal use of language. People are saying, oh, words are violence, or these are mine, call me this or call me that. It's this kind of like literalism and everything, which is, could only really have come out of sort of the Protestant Anglosphere, quite honestly. It's colonizing everyone else through power, but it's not really relevant. I mean, even, the use of pronouns, like they, them. In Hungary, it's quite, it doesn't apply because it's a gender-neutral language. If you put Hungarian into Google Translate, and it's like talking about a man, it will just often just say she when it comes out of it, because you can't tell reading Hungarian if it's a man or a woman, and the formal uses they anyway. So in a sense, the Hungarians were woke for 1,000 years, so leave them alone. But this idea of high and low context. Now, a high context culture would be like Japan, where so much is about implicit knowledge. Hungary's kind of in between. I mean, there is so much about Hungary where the context is everything. I had a friend once who was once at an event, and he asked if it was on the record or off the record, some interview, and he was told, oh no, it's on the record. So he wrote about it, and then there was pushback saying, why did you write about that? And he said, well, I was told it's on the record. And he said, well, from the context, you should have worked out clearly it was not on the record. So it was kind of interesting, like it wasn't quite so clear. And living in Hungary for 5 years, there's often this sense that someone will say something to you, and you just have to kind of work out what they actually mean. There is a lot of, if you approach it with a very Anglo mindset, you just won't know. So there's kind of like, sometimes things are lost in translation like that, between sort of semi-high context culture and fairly low context sort of mindset that I brought to Hungary in a sense. But there's a second thing I want to talk about here just on this, which is my own framing on it, which is that I've thought for about 10 years that you can map most of our lives on two axes. There's the relationships, like not romantic, I think, but just human relationships. We are a relational animal. I mean, bear in mind, the worst thing you can do to someone in prison is other than physically torture them, is put them in solitary isolation. Why? Because prisons know that social interaction is what makes us, right? It's crucial to us. So we're a relational animal, so we have relations, but we also have something else as humans that no other species have. We have narrations, we have stories. And if you think about it, a human relationship, you and I meet, and we have we meet, we get to know each other, that's a relationship, there's trust built. And then you can also have an institution you build, an institute, or the rule of law or something. These are not relationships, these are narrations, these are stories, right? So you can have the trust in a relation and the truth of a narration, in a sense. And I think you can kind of plot cultures on how relational to narrational they are. So in Britain, for instance, if we used to have gentlemen's agreements, that's long gone. But in America, certainly, you can agree with something with someone, shake their hand, look them in the eye, if Americans ever look people in the eye, which is quite rarely. But what's interesting is that if it's not written down and signed, until that point, it's not a deal. And no one has any moral commitment to it until it's signed, right? In fact, they never have a moral commitment. There's a sense it's a legal commitment. Now, what I've discovered in Hungary is, so Hungarians, first of all, when you speak to them, if you ever, tonight, if you have a drink, and you clink glasses with anyone here who's Hungarian, you'll notice they look you in the eye. It's very interesting. It's nice, actually, though sometimes it can be, if you're not used to it, it can be like that. They're a lot of eye contact. It's a very relational culture. And what I've discovered in Hungary is if someone looks you in the eye and shakes your hand and agrees something, that thing will happen. I have a story of this, a friend who 20 years ago bought a house in Budapest, or rather he went to look at a house. It's a beautiful old pagoda on a building. And he met the guy who owned it, and the guy said, "Are you interested?" He said, "Oh yeah, I'm interested." And the guy said, "Okay." And then my friend left, and he had no money, like at all. And he was like, "Well, I would love to live there, I liked it." He didn't want to say like no, but he said, "Yeah, yeah." But he assumed the guy would just sell it to someone else the next week. A year passes, and my friend comes into an inheritance, and enough money to buy it. So he calls the guy and says, "Hey, that apartment, I guess it's probably long gone." And the guy goes, "No, you said you wanted it, so I've held it." And for an entire year with no communication, he's held onto it because the guy had looked in the eye and said, "I'll keep it for you." And that is like absolutely my experience in Hungary. If someone looks at you in the eye and they say they're going to do it, unless there's an act of God, then they really will do it. And it's been, I kind of joke sometimes, I've become a therapist to some colleagues in Hungary, the foreigners, because some foreigners show up from the UK, or particularly the Anglosphere, and they show up and they'll say, right, they've been agreed they're going to come to Hungary and they'll have a contract to do a job. And then they'll show up and the contract still hasn't arrived. Maybe there's been no correspondence at all since they're invited. And they'll arrive and they'll have an apartment they've flown in, and then they'll go to work on the first day. They're still not signed a contract. And then weeks could go past with no contract. Or indeed their contract may have ended and then they've been told to get an extension, and then they just don't hear anything for a long time. And I've had several people say to me, have they gone off me? They don't want me, they just don't want to tell me what's happening. And I always said, like, did they look you in the eye? Yes, that's fine. And it's always been the case that they've always got the contract. But it's really interesting that the relational really counts for something. There's moral investment in it. And I was talking to a couple of weeks ago, I was at what's known as a bograc. It's like a big stew you cook all day and drink palinka in the Hungarian countryside. And I was with a bunch of colleagues and friends there, and I was talking to this guy who's Hungarian, and he unilaterally brought up something. He said, you know, in this country, he said, throughout history, we have been failed by institutions, governments. We never really know where we stand. We were just talking earlier that even the legal system in Hungary has changed 3 times in the last 30 years. There was a communist legal system, there was a new one brought in 1990, there was a revision in 2012, and who knows, maybe there's another revision coming. So the thing is, in a sense, you can't really trust the legal system to remain the same. There's constant dynamism in it. So what can you trust in? You can trust in the people you know. And it's kind of why I think a lot of Hungary is all about those personal relationships. I could talk more about that, but suffice to say at this point that this is another thing that I think that in terms of their relationship to each other, the way the culture operates is, in my view, very different from, say, the Anglosphere. I've probably gone well over what my time is, I think, here. But just to kind of wrap up, and I really mean it this time. So this talk's called Hungary in the Uncanny Valley, Misrecognition, Proximity, and the Limits of Western Empathy. One of the diseases of the Anglosphere is that we are victims of our own success. And in the Anglosphere, we've for so long been so culturally dominant, we've lost an awareness of the conditions that made that possible. And we've also lost, I think, a curiosity about other cultures. And this is particularly the case when it looks at the East Asia and so on in China right now. My point there is not to say who's better or who's worse, but there's a lack of curiosity. And without curiosity, one can make mistakes. And I do think an interesting example of this within Europe in the last few decades probably has been, as Hungary has grown in terms of its presence and I wouldn't say reputation, but it's grown in its sort of relevance to the European stage, there has, and indeed perhaps the global stage, there's been a lot of challenges of people understanding it. But one of the challenges in Hungary that often, when people come to Hungary, on day one you know nothing. You don't know anything about the culture, like you can say anywhere. Day two you know way more than day one, right? Obviously, because you've learned a lot, and so you get very confident. And then if you stay for day three, your confidence slowly starts to drop until you end up with a sort of humble sense. You're not quite sure what you know, but you know you don't know, right? Which is a healthy place in which to write your op-ed about Hungary. The problem is, what I've witnessed the last 5 years, is whether people come to praise or condemn Hungary or whatever the government is on either side, it doesn't matter if they come to praise or condemn, they've tended to write their articles on day two, when they're very confident in what they know, but actually don't know how little they know. And what I see is people coming and projecting onto it their own set of assumptions, particularly from the Anglosphere. There is a sense that people come and they just see it as a place to imagine their own dreams of how the world ought to be. Conservatives would come and say, you know, with the previous government, and say this is the mecca of conservatism in the world. And then obviously, you know, the liberals would come and say this is awful, or now say this is now the mecca, this sort of thing. And I just think it's more subtle than that. It's more complicated than that. Hungarians are politically don't fit easily on the map of politics from an Anglosphere perspective. They don't never look that conservative from a British conservative perspective, and they certainly don't look liberal now based on a liberal understanding of things. It needs to be understood on its own terms, but that is the case for most of the world. Most places need to be understood on their own terms. So this talk has been about Hungary, but actually it's kind of been the kind of bait and switch here. It's actually about my own culture, because there is I don't know how much I've learned about Hungary being there, but I've learned that I don't know. But one thing I have come to learn a lot is things I didn't recognize about my own culture and some of the hubrises in it that are blinding us to some of the consequences of actions at a time where consequences have real consequences, or actions have real consequences. So for me at least, it's been a kind of humbling and educational experience being there the last 5 years. I don't know how much longer I'm staying, but it's been real, and it's been great, best experience of my life. And I also want to say thank the Listening Institute for inviting us at the Danube Institute to come here regularly over the last year, just to have chats like this, and then to have a chat here, and then to take some questions. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. It was very fascinating to listen to your own personal story, but also your remarks on Hungarian culture, language, and history, and so on. I went a bit the other way. So I was born in Hungary, part of the German minority in Hungary, because there is one, without going into too much details. But when I was 9 years old, my parents took me to Germany. And still today, if I go to Germany, people don't even notice I have a migration background, as they say. But it took me about 15 years to bridge this gap between Hungarian mentality and German mentality until I fully understood the other country, even though I spoke the language when I arrived in Bavaria. So it was not any kind of romanticized Hungarian identity. It was extremely subtle how it shaped your thinking, how it shaped your worldview. What you pointed out about in history, I immediately had a conflict in school in history class, because I took it seriously. Other people didn't took it seriously, and it was not only my own passion for history, it was really that I had a completely different understanding of what history is, how it shapes your personal life, and so on. Without going into too much into my how I bridged the gap between the two cultures, the big thing is that southern Germany, Bavaria, is as close to Hungary as it can be, because there was a lot of cultural exchange over time. Nevertheless, there was a huge gap. So Hungary somehow managed to have its own identity, even though it was on the crossroads to the German sphere of influence, the Slavic, the Turkish, the Russian, and so on. That's highly remarkable. And just to and very interesting was when you were comparing the English language to the Hungarian one, because they are in many ways the complete opposite. So and it's not only the linguistic one, how the peoples treat their own language. So English is basically a Germanic language with a lot of French vocabulary just whacked onto it. The pronunciation, because of this, is completely, from Hungarian point of view, it's first, we are confused, because it's completely, you have the same spelling of a word, but you pronounce it completely differently. And this shows how that you were very organic how your language grown. Hungarian, even though it's a Finno-Ugric language on the Uralic branch, as you pointed out, so it's only a few Siberian languages are related to Hungarian. In practice, it behaves like an isolated language, because even from isolated from these Uralic ones, because the Hungarians migrated to Central Europe, over time it became saturated with German and Slavic words, actually. So in the 18th and 19th century, Hungarian linguists went out and tried to reinvent the Hungarian language from again. It's like an endeavor, like imagine that you're in Italian in the US, without knowing what real Italian language is, and without knowing what Italian in Italy looks nowadays. And you try to reinvent your own language, so it will be kind of like Italian, but it wouldn't be like anything Italian. So it would be a completely own species that you would deal. So this is very interesting, and this is why even though the rules are very very strange from a Western perspective, they are highly regular, and it's you immediately notice if somebody is not speaking correct Hungarian. This is so. In this regard, they're complete opposite. Very interesting is with this high trust, low trust that you have pointed out, because Hungarians are kind of flexible when it comes to trust and context. They're in kind of like a middle position. So southern Germany, where I was in, is much more a high context, and also certainly more high trust. This was one part of my problem when we went there. It is even more tribal than Hungary in many regards, but Hungary is in a sweet spot. It's not in this regard. It's not isolated. It can be like a bridge between the Anglosphere or even more high trust societies. So when I see Hungarian students going abroad, they are actually kind of adaptable often enough. That's very very interesting, because they're not in this uncanny valley as many other people say. So it's I very much like it. Sometimes it's a bit frustrating, because you're from the outside and you're like, oh, the Hungarian preoccupation with the language and the historical narratives, you could be a bit more pragmatical about some stuff. And then on the long run, I learned really to appreciate it, and that was a very, very interesting experience to be on both sides, and it was very fascinating to listen to you from the English perspective. And I mean, within 5 years in Hungary, I think you have learned a lot about the country, to be honest. That's really, and I think at one point you will master languages, so I hope you will stay in Budapest for a long time.
Well, thanks. I mean, the language is I mean, it's, to be honest, it's not probably as hard as I made it out to be. I've just been a little bit lazy at times, and I have to acknowledge that as part of my, it's like admitting, you know, you're an alcoholic. I've just been lazy with this. I don't like language classes. I find it very stressful to go to language class. But yeah, I mean, it's just I mean, thanks for what you said about the culture and history. Look, a lot of what I said is my very subjective impressions, and I don't state them as facts. More, these are my impressions, and feel free to agree or disagree. And if you think that there's some sense of it, then I appreciate that. I'm glad. Yeah, I think the language will take a bit longer to engage with. But I learned a fact recently about Hungary, not quite related to what you were saying, but it reminds me of it because you were talking about the 19th century and some of the revisions. Okay, well, you already know the answer based on how I've set this up, but does anyone know the last country in the world, other than the Vatican, to use Latin as the operating government language? The answer is Hungary. They only disbanded Latin as literally the operating language for the entire government, the civil service language in like the 1840s, which was extraordinary because they're not even a nation with Latin in the original, with relationship to the original language. So quite extraordinary. And that's 1840 is not that long ago, you know.
Here the question is which Hungary? because as we know, after the Battle of Mohács, Hungary was broken apart. So that's one of the things, because the Kingdom of Hungary, the Habsburg part, obviously because it was Catholic, this is why they had Latin. The Transylvanian part, which is in many regards the real Hungarian kingdom that survived, I had a wild mix. I don't even know, but because they were Calvinists, they were Presbyterian, they had a different tradition, and they were also ethnically more mixed already in the Middle Ages. So that was a very, very interesting thing. This is why Hungarian language flourished there, because the Bible was translated there and so on. This is
something. I have a friend in Budapest who was telling me years ago. He said we're always being accused of being like these ethno-nationalists or like being Hungarian. But he said actually, and this guy's a pretty conservative guy, and he said the thing is, being Hungarian is actually a cosmopolitan identity. He said, look at 1848. Look at the generals. The generals who rebelled against the Habsburgs were Serbs, Romanians, Slovaks, Jews, Transylvanians. All these different groups were among the people who were Hungarian. And he said, actually, the notion of being Hungarian is, in a sense, kind of it's a cosmopolitan identity. And I think even the former Prime Minister said being Hungarian is an attitude, and I think that's kind of true as well. So there's always this question of what is it to be something, but it's quite interesting that sometimes I think from the outside people think the Hungarians are like this, almost like this sort of ethnic enclave in the center of Europe with a bunch of pikes around it, guarding with a very peculiar language, and it's much more historically interesting than that.
Yeah. So, one question for the future: do you think how is the English language transforming, especially younger Hungarians? Are they losing their Hungarianness in some sort because they're exposed to all this American culture, for example?
Okay, so I'd say, so first of all, I'll try and say a couple of things here. One is that American cultural imperialism is coming for all of us. I mean, it took us Brits first, and it's slowly colonizing everyone else for as long as the Americans are the dominant culture, and they may not remain so. Who knows what's going to happen? But there's always this case that you feel like sometimes I feel the Americanization of Hungary is a bit further behind. But the other thing, there's kind of something like deeper than language, which is that in the Anglosphere, everything is kind of has an ironic detachment. So people don't eat their food; they photograph their food, and that type of thing. And it's very interesting. There's I go every summer to this wonderful festival in actually Romania, but in historic Hungary, in Transylvania, and it's called Tusványos. And it's it was set up in 1990 by people who went on to found the Fidesz party, which just lost the election last month. And they set it up to re-establish civil society and democratic thinking post-communism. It was literally founded in Ceausescu's body was still warm, quite literally, I think, when the guys got together in a pub in Transylvania, a guy called Zsolt Nemet, David Campanelli, some other guys, and they got together and they had the idea of just having a student camp in the countryside, and it just grew and grew and grew, now I guess like 30,000 people. It's very interesting, worth going to. And at this thing, I go every year, and my favorite place to go is to sit at the trestle tables. You've been to Tusványos? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you go to trestle tables in front of the dance house. Táncház is a Hungarian sort of folk dance, which was in all the villages, particularly in Transylvania. And under communism, as these dances were dying out, a filmmaker from Budapest went out and filmed the dances, brought the film back to Budapest. People showed the dances, performed them, and people started learning them. It became such a craze of Hungarian identity that the communist government suppressed it, which drove it underground, which made it even cooler. And so everyone kept doing it. So to this day now, Táncház, which in some sense is the version of it today, is like a 1970s invention, or the invention of a tradition, is central to a certain form of Hungarian cultural identity with this like conservative lean on it. So you see a lot of Táncház at Tusványos.
It's a very, very interesting linguistic thing that you made here. Sorry to go into this, but because in both dance and house are Germanic words in English, so they are not French origin. Obviously, in German has the same with Tanzhaus, and this is exactly the same structure what I was describing with Nervit, so that often enough, this they took the German words, translated them to Hungarian, and still used the same structure for some stuff only. And this is one of those words. But that Tanzhas, which is actually most Germanic loanwords into Hungarian. So here you see a connection from through Central Europe in this. This is why it sounded so similar and it mixed it up.
It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't know that actually. Sorry, I got sidetracked talking about Tanzhaus. So the point, no, I got sidetracked. So where I was going with this was that I was sitting in the Trestle Tables a few years ago, and there was a guy playing his violin, who's a well-known violin player in that community, and there was a guy called Pishti Istvan who had a bottle of wine. He was a bit drunk, and his bottle of wine was bouncing on the table, and wine was going on the violin. They almost had a bit of a fight over this. But around them, and they were singing these old Hungarian songs, sadness about the loss of country, and they're singing songs. And there was like 50 Hungarians around, everyone singing together. And I was sitting there as the only foreigner in those groups, sitting quite still, because I didn't want anyone to break out of it to try and explain to me what was happening. It was kind of obvious what was happening. But then I was watching it, and I thought, what is weird about this? There's something here that I like, but it's unusual. And then I worked out what it was. Not a single person had their phone out, filming it. No one was ironically detached, consuming it as an experience to display later. Everyone is simply having the experience. Whereas if that had happened in contemporary England, you would have had one guy on the violin, one drunk guy with a bottle, two people maybe similarly drunk dancing or singing with them, and the rest would be consuming this authentic culture as a product to show on Instagram or something. And to this day, actually, sometimes in Budapest, I went to this Bogodács the other day, and it's very interesting how at the Bogodács, this stew, all the Hungarians were just singing songs, having a nice time, but the foreigners kept whipping their phones out and were filming things. It was really interesting, and I was like, guys, just put your phones away. It's just, you don't have to film everything. And it's a very interesting culture. So my point in this is that beyond simply language, what's happened in the Anglosphere is, in my view, we have become so detached from anything that everything is consumed as a product, And whereas in Hungary, I find people actually will not be thinking about something else and being elsewhere. They'll be very present. I think my favorite thing about Hungary, and this doesn't apply to everyone, of course, but a disproportionate number of people, the experience I've had in Hungary is that people are extraordinarily present when you speak to them. They're making eye contact with you, their phone is away, they're actually present in the conversation, they're engaged with things. Though one friend said to me, they're paying attention to you because you speak too fast and they're trying to follow what you're saying. But sometimes even when I slow down, they pay just as much attention. So it's like, it's a very present culture, and that is something that I don't think the Anglosphere ever really was. We're always off on our heads dreaming of past empires or future empires. And whereas the Hungarians are very, very present. And again, it's that relationality. Like, we're often a narration and a story in our head. They're very just relational. And I'm generalizing to an extent because you can't generalize about everyone. But what I found is in Hungary, I'll have more conversations where I feel I really actually had a human connection with someone. I'll have more in a single day, even with people I don't even really like, I'll feel I've done that, than I'll have in like a month in the UK with people I do like. So it's, in this sense, you never really feel, it's a funny culture because I wonder if sometimes, because it is kind of a lonely culture linguistically, it's not that lonely within it. Or maybe I'm overstating that, but sometimes I feel that's the case. So my point is, the language may be, the English may take the language, or the English may start, people will speak more of it, but I have a sense that actually just that way of being, which is actually quite Hungarian, is a psychological substrata, and I don't think that's going to go anywhere, and it's tied into the language.
I think that's more telling about the British or the Anglosphere perspective, because many other people who come to the UK or the US first, they are complaining that, oh, they are so superficial, because people immediately smile, have small talk with you, but they don't really mean it. They don't really commit to you.
I'm not superficial. I'm shallow. No,
so this is our feeling. This is the stereotype that you have of especially of Americans. But then you later learn that just because somebody uses the first name, it's not a personal relationship yet and stuff. And often enough, to be honest, you're a tough nut to crack. But to form a real friendship with a British person is not easy, because the formality of language is detached from real commitment. So you don't have the signal from that makes it very hard. Even French people are struggling with this, because we have in the language of vous form and the tu form, and then it's very clear when you switch. But
well, it's interesting because sometimes, I mean, this is maybe sounding overly therapeutic, but sometimes in the UK I feel people in Britain don't have enough depth for me to stay that interested in the conversation, and then in Hungary I feel like the shallow one. So it's really interesting the different experiences, and so my frustration turns to sort of insecurity as I cross cultures. But there's a lot of truth in that. And I think the Brits, there was this. Someone once said British conversation is like a quadrille in a sentry box. So it's trying to have a dance inside a telephone box, you know. And you speak to a British person, it's like, oh, the weather is lovely, you know. And it's all these sort of ways to converse without actually revealing anything. And there's a great so actually I shouldn't joke about this, but it's kind of funny. The story's not funny, but you'll see why it's kind of contextually funny. Was so in Hungarian. So in English, if you say, how are you? People say, I'm fine, thank you. And it's not a real question. If someone tells you how they are, you're like, what are they talking about? I don't want to know all this stuff. But in Hungarian, if you say, hogy, which is, how are you? Someone will really tell you. And I'm slightly changing the story here because it's a very specific thing. But once I had a friend and I texted him and I said, hogy, and said, this is a tough question to ask me because my father just died and I've just been sick and someone else in my family, and it was like, and the dog got run over. It was like a whole sequence of things. And she wasn't joking. And it was like, and I was like, oh, I was just asking how you were, but she told me. And no, I don't want to laugh about it. It was a very tragic month she had. But it was, but it kind of was this, it was an extreme example of this difference. So the English, we're masters of saying nothing at great length.
Yeah, and this explains from Jordan Peterson. There's a viral video out there when they just asked him, how are you? And he broke out in tears after 2 minutes because he had a terrible month. But honestly, I had this experience several times in my family, that this question, how are you, led to heated fight or something else within minutes. Because it's honest, but in English-speaking YouTube world, it was like a complete shock that somebody really answered this question.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've often felt that guy, we were talking about Jordan Peterson, and I'm not personally a big fan, but I do think something, I actually find it quite hard to follow what he says, but I actually think his significance in the culture is because of his emotional presence. You can feel it through the screen. You know the way they say some actors are just made for the big screen. Like they're actors that there's something about them that comes through the screen. They may not even be the best technical actor, but there's something about them that's compelling. You know, like Tom Cruise is not an Oscar-winning actor or anything, but he's really compelling for some reason. And it's not just how he looks or something, it's just his intensity. And I kind of think Peterson's, what he says is less the point, it's how he presents himself, that kind of raw wound. And in a culture where there's a lot of people being constantly told not to bury their emotions, there is a kind of catharsis in seeing someone bleed on camera emotionally. And I often feel what makes him compelling is the publicness of his emotions.
Yeah, so coming back from an Anglosphere public person back to Hungary, I mean, you mentioned in your introduction that Hungarians love to speak about Mohács, but also about Trianon. Like this is like this is not only a national insult, but also a personal wound that people are like. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because, as I said, like you know, Brits, we talk a lot about our history, but Hungarian history makes them fall into silence. And I remember when I'd first been in Hungary, there's a really great place to go in Budapest. It's not open that often, it's called Fono. It's like a dance house place, it's like a folk dancing place. And if you go through Fono, the bar, and out the back, there's like a concrete area with a bar, and in the corner there's like a cooker, and they're always cooking like Transylvanian meats. And I remember going there with a bunch of friends, and there was just in the corner, there was just this handsome violinist surrounded by 20 young Hungarian women just crying, he was playing these old songs. And it was just this, it was this very strange, it was great, it was beautiful, but there was a sense of like, the history is very living. I mean, that's an extreme case, but the history is very present in things, and people really do feel it. And this is where I think the Anglosphere doesn't understand, and I don't think people really understand these sorts of traumas and the stories that come out of them and the emotions of it. They're real. Like, it's not just a history book. It's not just dead history. It really lives. And I think that's one of the hardest changes to make. Because as I said, like, I think, if you look at the British history, it has been one victory or lucky escape after another. We have very little to lament. It's been good fun. It's been, people say, I had a great war, And my grandfather was like, I had a lovely war. I went to India, played a lot of tennis, did some stuff in the hospital, and he fought and was involved in stuff he doesn't want to talk about. But it was kind of like, obviously he lost people he knew, but there's a real difference, I think, in if one has a very different historical experience. And I do think sometimes the Anglosphere right now is somewhat pickled by our own successes, a little bit.
What do you think about this eternal thing that upsets Hungarians to be classified as Eastern European, not Central European? Does this make any sense to you as a British person?
So, it's very interesting how Hungarians will change it depending on the context. So they'll say, well, of course, we're Central European, unless there's something that they're feeling a little shameful about. So, well, this is just Eastern Europe. So it's a bureaucratic, well, it's Eastern Europe, but if it's something good, they'll say this is Central Europe. So it toggles a little bit. I personally like Eastern Europe. I spend a lot of time in Romania. I love Romania, and a lot of it in Transylvania, but I love Romanians in Romania. It's a great place. But that's definitely Eastern Europe, and I have no problem with Eastern Europe. So for me to say it's Eastern Europe is not a criticism, but I have to say something in Hungary. The polite thing to say is Central or Central Eastern Europe. But I think this is just one of those things where, it's. I think a lot of cultures are kind of like this. I mean, Brits, North and South, is kind of like this. French Canada a bit too. I think it's just natural enough that people play with these categories and get offended occasionally, but it's not very subjective. Yeah, that's just human nature.
Yeah, so obviously this is, you pointed in relation to that Hungary is like, even if it's Central Europe, it's like the edge of Central Europe, and it's wedged between Eastern Europe and Southern Europe in many senses. So you have, Hungarian goulash is a good example. It's basically a slow-cooked stew, which is in its basic very Slavic, but with Turkish spices.
Okay, so one joke I have is that the Hungarians are like emotional Germans or organized Italians, and that's kind of my compromise. And or you could flip it around and say they are less organized Germans and less emotional Italians. You could do it either way depending on how you put it. But it's interesting that sometimes there's kind of a Mediterranean sort of fire in Hungary, but then this kind of superstructure of sort of Germanic organization in some ways. It's a very interesting composite. But it really culturally reflects the fact it is the middle of all these things. There've been some funny things that have come back to me since I moved to Hungary. So when I was a kid, my favorite movie as a teenager, I was quite sort of, had this sort of romantic mindset. One of my favorite movies was The English Patient. I loved The English Patient. And The English Patient is a film about a Hungarian count who's in the Middle East, and he falls in love, and then he is injured in a plane and burnt. And the story toggles between his former life, and now he's like very badly burnt. And this woman's caring for him, and he has a diary, and she keeps reading his diary, and she's reading his diary to him, and he's coming back his memories of what happened. Anyway, as a kid, I didn't really know what a Hungarian was, but it was a beautiful movie. Ralph Fiennes is in it, great actor, and. Anyway, the opening song of the film, there's an opening shot where there's a camera facing down on the desert, on the dunes, and the music comes on, and it's a folk singer singing. And it sounded to me, because of the sand and it's the Middle East, it sounded to me, I assumed it was an Arabic folk song or an Arabic love song or something, because the way the voice was going sounded Arab to me. And because it was in a desert, I just assumed it was an Arabic song. And I've always loved that piece of music. I bought the CD to listen to that piece of music. I love that piece of music, I love it. I've loved it my whole life. And I listened to it every few months. And I moved to Hungary in 2021. And then I said, you've got to listen to this piece of music to someone. And I put it on. And I played it. And then I was listening to it. And then I heard the person singing. I learned, I think this is Saralem, is that correct? And Love, Love. And I realized, she's speaking Hungarian. And then I realized the song is not an Arabic folk song. I looked it up, I was like, it's a Hungarian folk song. But it sounded Eastern. It sounded Middle Eastern, and it was to my ear. And because this sort of use of like sharp notes and stuff in Hungarian, and focus on English sharps, not really musical, but like there's certain keys that Hungarian music is in that's more Middle Eastern to me than it is Western. So it's a really interesting composite. It's between all these different influences. And as Milan Kundera wrote a piece in the 80s called The Tragedy of Central Europe. And it begins with a story about Hungary and a radio message that went out from Hungarian radio in 1956. And he said the tragedy of Central Europe is it's culturally Western, but politically Eastern. And so, so a lot of its cultural reference was Western, but a lot of its political sort of impulse is quite Eastern. And so the politics in Hungary is quite tough, you know, it's quite sort of feudal in a sense within parties and so on. And it feels much more like, it's quite alien, you know, to a British mindset. But culturally, lots in common. And this is, again, the uncanny valley. It's hard to reconcile things.
Yeah, I mean, not all, even the architecture of the parliament is recognizable. I mean, it was different style, but it was modeled after Westminster, like next to the river as well.
It is, but then the little color codes in it, the roofs, look Eastern. And it's so, it's like, yeah, it's like the structure is like Western European, and then it's just it's this playful color scheme on it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's Westminster system, but with a specific Eastern twist.
With Hungarian characteristics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Hungarian. Yeah, exactly. Obviously, full Hungarian imagery and stuff. Yeah, it's very interesting that you say that. Yeah, but when we were waiting, we began to speak about 19th century Hungarian politics, but and it was very interesting how that kind of re-emerged, and it was so. My point is that because politics is very, it was completely reshaped, as you mentioned, that the legal system, constitution stuff. Nevertheless, some fundamental patterns seem to re-emerge over hundreds of years. It's the survived Nazis, Soviets, whatever, and so it's something is very deeply engraved into the country that is making making the structures again and again. It's like very interesting.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this, that the almost Hungarian politics works in 20 or 30 year cycles. You were talking about like from 1870 to 1905, there was like one party, and then 1906 to 1920, and then 20 to 40, and then different areas. And it's interesting, and maybe it's just happening again now in shifts in years.
Yeah, so it's very, very interesting. Do we want to? Yeah, we want to.
Questions or?
Yeah.
You said the legal system in Hungary has changed 3 times. Would you describe it a little bit? How it was, how it is, the changes?
That was. Do we want to first collect? Oh, no, I think I just answered this question. So obviously the Constitution, 1949, then the big revision in 1990, then the 2012 Constitution, but also the Civil Code or the Criminal Code. You can see the same similar patterns going. Obviously, there are some. It's still Roman law and continental civil law that is behind it. Nevertheless, it's if you look in France, it's basically the same criminal code since 1808. That's a completely different trajectory, and also how much it was changed. It's very, very. It was a bigger changes than were made to the similar laws in France or in Germany at the same time. So it's much more unsteady, I think, that we can say.
You just made me think that there's a British law lord called Jonathan Sumption. He's been in the Supreme Court. He's a historian as well, a brilliant historian, and he made an observation that constitutions are always the products of wars, civil wars, revolutions, or colonialism. And he said they don't. And one thing, the British Constitution, by contrast, is its great continuity in common law for the last 900 years or something. It's just slowly sedimented. We don't have a constitution. We kind of do informally, just because we have this long history of law that's been unbroken, because we never really had. We were never colonized. We never had a proper war that defeated us. We were not. We had a civil war, but we kind of got through it. It's this interesting counterexample, you know. But Hungary has obviously been in the middle of so many of these things. Yeah. It's been colonized. There've been wars. There've been civil wars too, essentially. So, and they've had revolutions. So it's. it's a good candidate for these quick changes. But the question would be, will it ever stabilize? Will it ever not have that? And this comes back to the point about a culture that trusts in relationships, because if the narrations, the institutions, the rule of law, the stories we tell ourselves and we all agree is the story, if that keeps changing, then what do you really trust? People. Then you know. Any other questions?
No questions, but
Yeah.
I like very much that, no question, but I like very much that you feel well in Transylvania. I was born in Cluj in the generation with three, father German, mother Hungarian and Romania. And so I have the opportunity to compare the languages. I'm not a professional like you, but it was very interesting to see how they, the daily or the monthly money, how they have. And with German, they earn the money. They need to work for it, how much you earn this month. The Romanian people, how much you win. They didn't do nothing, sorry, but they win. Oh, like the French, they win the money. And the psychological part by Hungarian, you ask, how many have you searched, mennyit kerestél?
How many do you
search? You search it.
You search?
Yes.
So you earn money, you win money, and you search.
Yeah, the Hungarian search money, and it was very, for me, a shock. The answer was, it was not, so I win, so I have this money. It was, the answer was the same, I search so and so, ennyit kerestem. Always they are searching the money. And that is a very interesting psychological thing with all the problems the Romanian it's a little bit locker, the German need to work, and the Hungarian they are to finalize the comparative.
I just want to know from your opinion, are there any common characteristics along the riversides of Danube, different countries, but
okay, so
influence of the river?
Well, it's a great question, given I work at the Danube Institute. Okay, so there's a book I could recommend on that by a man called Nick Thorpe, Thorpe. Nick Thorpe is a BBC correspondent for Hungary since 1986.